Welcome to the American Story. Stories about all the things that make America the country we know and love. The place of slavery in the American founding is one of the great and enduring questions of American history. My old friend Thomas West, professor of politics at Hillsdale College, has a chapter on the theme in his excellent book, Vindicating the Founders. It is the best brief reflection I know of on the subject, and well worth reading. This is one of 3 stories that is greatly indebted to it. Any errors that slip in are, of course, exclusively my own. This is Chris Flannery with the Claremont Institute. I call this one Anti-Slavery Declaration. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia rose in the Philadelphia State House to put forward to the representatives of the United Colonies of America in General Congress assembled a resolution for independence. Resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. In discussions over the succeeding days, the resolution failed to win unanimous approval. But circumstances were changing rapidly, so Congress delayed consideration until July 1st, when they might achieve the hoped-for unanimity. And in preparation for approval of the resolution for independence, Congress appointed a committee of 5 to produce the formal text of a Declaration of Independence, which was destined to become the most sacred American political scripture and the fundamental act of American union. On the committee would be Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert Livingston of New York. We have charmingly different versions of how Jefferson became the leading draftsman of the committee, but he certainly did. Jefferson produced a draft, the committee reviewed it, Adams and Franklin each made small suggestions and corrections, Jefferson made some further corrections, and on June 28, the Committee of 5 presented a draft of a declaration to Congress. On July 1st, Congress again took up Lee's resolution for independence, debated it intensely and at length one last time, and delayed a vote again to the next day, when they managed to achieve a certain kind of unanimous approval of the resolution. Only then, beginning late on July 2nd and continuing on July 3rd and 4th, and in the midst of the pressing business of fighting a war, did Congress turn its attention to the draft of the Declaration submitted to them by the Committee of 5, discussing it and editing it into the final form we have today. In their remarkably thoughtful editing, they made many interesting and important changes, including deletion of a passage denouncing the King of Great Britain for imposing the slave trade on America. Here is part of the passage from Jefferson's draft that Congress deleted. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian King of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce. This deleted passage reminds us that the logic of the Revolution was inseparable from the logic of emancipation. If the king was waging war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty by enslaving a distant people who never offended him, then that distant people possessed the same human nature and the same sacred rights as all other men. They are included in the phrase, all men are created equal. The passage also refers to the king keeping a market where men should be bought and sold. Everyone understood that men, women, and children were bought and sold in those slave markets. So this passage helps us know that the phrase all men refers to all human beings, and that was how it was understood by its authors and editors. Jefferson records that Congress deleted the passage in deference to the slave-holding states of South Carolina and Georgia, and maybe also to our northern brethren who trafficked in slavery even if they didn't own slaves themselves. The revolutionaries were keenly aware that they were exposed to charges of hypocrisy by claiming a right to freedom that they were denying to their slaves. But there was no possibility of abolishing slavery immediately in the states where it was entrenched, and it would have been disastrous if the slave states set up a sovereign confederacy of their own. So, bending to pressure from the slave powers in their editing, Congress enlisted those slave powers in a revolution dedicated to the proposition that all men, including their slaves, are created equal. This was the greatest anti-slavery revolution in history, and if there was going to be a revolution now, emancipation would have to come later. The rallying cry of that emancipation, animating every political act of the great emancipator Abraham Lincoln, would be the 5 immortal words of the Anti-Slavery Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. Thanks for being part of the American Story. This is Chris Flannery with the Claremont Institute. If you'd like to learn more about these stories or how you might support them, please visit our website at www.theamericanstorypodcast.org. That's theamericanstorypodcast.org.